Before we understand the critical moment Iran lives today, we need to go back in time. Until the late 1970s, Iran was ruled by a secular monarchy led by the Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The country had a strong alliance with the United States and other Western powers. Shah sought to modernize the country at any cost. It promoted economic, social, and cultural reforms known as the White Revolution. But this modernization was accompanied by brutal political repression, censorship, persecution, and a growing social inequality. The Iranian people saw the richness of oil benefit only a small elite linked to the palace. Meanwhile, on the other side, in mosques and religious circles, a silent but determined opposition grew, led by a charismatic and uncompromising cleric called Ruhollah Khomeini. He, who lived in exile in France, began to spread his revolutionary messages through cassette tapes and clandestine pamphlets. Its proposal was clear: to overthrow the Shah regime and implement an Islamic republic, governed by religious laws and controlled by the clerics. In 1979, after months of protests on the streets, general strikes, and popular pressure, the Shah was forced to escape the country, and Khomeini returned to Tehran as a hero. Iran was no longer a secular monarchy to officially become an Islamic republic. But what did this mean in practice? The power structure created by Khomeini was totally innovative in the modern world. For the first time, a contemporary state would be governed by a concept of Vilayat-e-Faqih, which means the government of the Islamic jurist. In other words, a system in which a supreme cleric would have a final authority over all political, military, and judicial institutions in the country. Khomeini assumed the position of supreme leader, a lifetime position with almost absolute powers. The Iranian president would continue to exist, elected by the people, but only within very well-defined limits. First, all presidential candidates need to be approved by the Guardian Council of the Revolution, an entity controlled by the clerics. That is, the people can choose, but only among the names that the regime authorizes. Even after being elected, the president is not free to make major decisions without the approval of the supreme leader. Issues such as foreign policy, national security, defense, justice, and especially the Iranian nuclear program are all directly controlled by religious leadership. This rigid structure transformed Iran into a theocracy with a facade of democracy. In practice, real power is focused on a man's hands, the supreme leader. Today, this man is Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Khomeini's direct successor since 1989. Khamenei, even without the charisma of the founder of the revolution, has consolidated an even more absolute power over the decades. But the regime does not survive only from internal political repression. Over the years, Iran has been projecting its power beyond its borders. Under the command of Khamenei, the country has invested heavily in the formation, financing, and weaponry of militias and paramilitary groups at various strategic points of the Middle East. Among them, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, the Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria. The goal was clear: to create a network of influence capable of pressuring Israel, the United States, and the Gulf monarchies. Iran has also developed a sophisticated ballistic missile program, capable of reaching targets thousands of kilometers away. Not to mention the controversial nuclear program, which for years has put Tehran in direct confrontation with the Western powers and, especially, with Israel. In recent decades, the Iranian regime has resisted international pressures, devastating economic sanctions and waves of internal protests. But now, in 2025, the scenario seems to begin to change. For the first time in years, Israel is not only concerned with containing the Iranian nuclear program. The focus is changing. Recent information indicates that Israel's strategy is expanding to directly reach military structures, economic infrastructure, and even the closest leaders of Khamenei's power circle. And this new Israeli stance did not come out of nowhere. It is the result of years of indirect clashes. Iran-backed militia attacks, bombing of military facilities in Syria, terrorist attacks orchestrated by pro-fire groups, and, of course, the constant threat that Tehran reaches nuclear capacity. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu himself has made increasingly incisive speeches. In recent statements, he not only defended more aggressive military actions, but also directly appealed to the Iranian people. Netanyahu encourages the citizens of Iran to rise against the Ayatollah regime. This is unprecedented in Israeli diplomacy. A public call for a regime change in Tehran. And inside Iran, the tension grows. Fear is palpable. On social networks, videos show panic scenes on the streets of Tehran. There are reports of families leaving the capital, predicting that a great conflict may be coming. Young activists, tired of decades of repression, begin to organize new protests. But everyone knows that the regime will not hesitate to use strength to maintain control. What is at stake now is not just the continuity of a government. It is the survival of a system that, for more than 4 decades, has shaped the politics, culture, and life of millions of Iranians. While the internal tension in Iran increases, the external scenario becomes even more explosive. To understand why Israel is raising the tone against Tehran, we must look at the regional performance of the Iranian regime in recent decades. Under the direct guidance of the supreme leader, Iran has built a complex network of allies, militias, and paramilitary groups that act as an extension of their foreign policy. Hezbollah in Lebanon is a classic example. Created in the 1980s with financing, training, and weaponry provided by Iran, the group became a powerful non-state military force, with thousands of rockets pointed to Israeli territory. Whenever there is an increase in tensions between Israel and Gaza, Hezbollah is triggered as part of the Iranian strategy to open multiple pressure fronts. Another example is the Houthis in Yemen, a Shiite rebel group who, with logistical support from Tehran, managed to master much of the country and launch drone and missile attacks against Saudi Arabia. In Iraq, Popular Mobilization Forces, a coalition of Shiite militias, follow loyal to Iranian interests, often confronting U.S. forces and local allies. In Syria, Iran has a direct military presence. During the civil war, he sent thousands of Revolutionary Guard fighters and mobilized Hezbollah to ensure the survival of the Bashar al-Assad regime. This continuous presence in Syria allowed Iran to create logistics corridors to transport weapons to Hezbollah in Lebanon. All of these movements are part of a centralized strategy and personally approved by Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Not only does it supervise, but gives the final endorsement to any military operation or logistical support that involves these forces abroad. And it is exactly this web of regional influence that Israel sees as an existential threat. Therefore, Israel's new strategy goes beyond occasional attacks on arms deposits or nuclear scientists. Now the Israeli government is adopting a broader approach, aiming at the backbone of the Iranian regime. Israel's defense forces intensified the bombing of Iranian positions in Syria, expanded cyber attacks against military and economic facilities in Iran, and, according to intelligence information, began to elaborate plans to directly reach targets within the Iranian territory itself. These targets range from military command centers to critical economy infrastructure, such as oil refineries and telecommunications centers. Even bolder, there are increasingly strong rumors that Israel considers the possibility of an attack aimed at Iranian military and political leadership. This change of posture reflects a strategic understanding. To contain Iran's advance and its threats, it is not enough to only destroy nuclear facilities. It is necessary to weaken the command capacity and control of the regime. This is a risky move. Stirring a country's leadership can trigger a major regional war. But for Israel, the cost of not acting can be even higher. Within this strategy, the information war also gains strength. Netanyahu, in his pronouncements, has spoken directly to the Iranian people. Instead of concentrating his messages only in world political leaders, he now sends clear scraps to the ordinary citizens of Iran, encouraging them to rise against Ayatollah. The speeches appeal to the daily suffering of the population, the repression, the lack of freedom, and the economic crisis that affects millions. This kind of direct communication has a double goal. On the one hand, weakening the morality of the regime, showing that Israel believes in an inevitable internal change. On the other hand, trying to arouse a new wave of protests that can somehow accelerate the process of political wear and tear in Tehran. And the signs of fissure within Iran begin to appear. Iranian society is tired. Years of economic sanctions, rampant inflation, unemployment, and repression created an environment of deep dissatisfaction. Street demonstrations, which were located and sporadic in the past, now appear more often and more reach. Women, for example, continue to lead resistance movements against compulsory clothing laws, challenging religious power in public. Young people, connected to the internet through private networks and VPNs, access information from the outside world, accompany messages from foreign leaders, and share police repression videos. Iranian universities were once again stages of confrontations between students and security forces. There are reports of strikes and stoppages in strategic sectors of the economy. But the regime still maintains theoretical control. Revolutionary Guard, a more faithful armed arm to the supreme leader, does not hesitate to use lethal force against protesters. The judicial system, controlled by clergy-line clerics, continues to condemn opponents to long prison sentences and even the death penalty. Nevertheless, the combination of international pressure, surgical military attacks, and growing internal social wear and tear is creating an environment of instability that Iran has not seen since the most troubled times of the Islamic Revolution. What once seemed an unshakable regime now gives signs of fragility. And in the face of this scenario, an inevitable question arises. Are we on the verge of a regime change in Iran? And if this change happens, what kind of future is waiting for the country and the whole region? As the political, military, and social siege closes over the Iranian regime, experts around the world begin to trace possible scenarios for what might happen if the Ayatollahs lose power. One of the most debated scenarios is the sudden collapse of the theocratic regime, something similar to what happened in Iraq after the fall of Saddam Hussein. This possibility is not just a theoretical exercise. It brings practical implications, with risks and opportunities for both the Iranian people and the stability of the entire Middle East. If the regime falls abruptly, the first consequence will be the immediate weakening of the networks of influence that Iran keeps out of its borders. Groups such as Hezbollah, Houthis, and Shiite militias in Iraq depend directly on financial, logistics, and strategic support from Tehran. Without centralized support, many of these groups can collapse, suffer internal divisions, or lose their operational capacity. On the other hand, there is the real fear that the vacuum of power within Iran is filled by even more radical forces. The recent history of the region shows that when authoritarian regimes fall without a clear transition plan, the result is often chaos. It was like this in Libya after the fall of Muammar Gaddafi, and in Iraq post-Saddam himself, who saw the emergence of groups such as the Islamic State. In the Iranian case, the fear is that even more extremist factions, or even regional warlords, dispute the country's control. Another scenario under discussion is the possibility of a return of the monarchy. The son of the last Shah, Reza Pahlavi, today exiled, has increased his presence in the international media. He gives interviews, participates in human rights forums, and tries to position himself as a democratic and westernized alternative to the future of Iran. However, historical rejection of the Shah period is still very strong within the country, especially among the generations that have grown under Islamic revolutionary narrative. There are also voices within the Iranian society itself that dream of the creation of a secular and democratic republic. Intellectuals, student leaders, women's rights advocates, and human rights activists have, over the years, built a stronger and stronger discourse against theocracy. But they face two huge challenges. First, the brutal repression that prevents them from organizing a cohesive movement within the country. Second, the absence of unifying political leadership that can conduct a transition process. Meanwhile, outside, international powers such as the United States, European Union, Russia, and China watch carefully. Each has their own interests. Washington, for example, could welcome the fall of the Ayatollah regime, but fears the unpredictable consequences that a chaotic transition could generate. Russia and China have strategic and commercial ties with Iran and would certainly try to influence any new government that arises in Tehran. Israel, in turn, continues with its maximum pressure strategy. The stated goal is to prevent Iran from reaching nuclear capacity, but behind the scenes, analysts point out that the real plan is to provoke the gradual collapse of the regime through a combination of military attacks, internal sabotage, and incentive for popular revolt. In the midst of all this geopolitical dispute is the Iranian people. There are millions of people who, for more than 4 decades, have lived under a regime that mixes religious repression with political authoritarianism. Daily suffering, aggravated by years of international sanctions, has made life difficult even for the most privileged layers of society. And now, with the increase in military tension, collective anxiety takes over the streets. The images of people leaving Tehran, carrying bags and trying to escape the country, are a reflection of the fear that spreads. Families fear direct conflict with Israel, an internal civil war, or even complete state disintegration. Iran's future remains uncertain. The end of the theocratic regime can open the doors to a new era of freedom and prosperity, but it can also trigger a new series of even more violent conflicts. What is clear is that the coming months will be decisive. If there is a fall from Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the world will need to act quickly. Intelligence and diplomacy to prevent Iran from plunging into a cycle of chaos like what we have seen in so many other countries in the region. More than ever, the fate of an entire nation depends on how this transition will be conducted. What began in 1979 with promises of justice and sovereignty now seems to walk to an unpredictable outcome, and the whole world watches with attention and apprehension in the next chapters of this story that is far from ending.